Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, 10 Lessons for Talking About Race. I'm Bridget Whalen, the Training and Engagement Coordinator of the Opportunity Agenda, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. A little bit about us. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds toward lasting policy and culture change. This year we're celebrating our 10th anniversary with a series of webinars that highlight some of the work we've done over the past decade that's been especially useful to our partners, and that includes our approach to talking about race, is the subject of today's webinar. We have a really exciting lineup of speakers today, and we want to thank them for sharing their time and expertise with us. We're joined by our own Senior Framing and Messaging Coordinator, Julie Fisher-Rao, Daryl Atkinson, who's the Visiting Second Chance Fellow at the U.S. Department of Justice, and Tia Oso, Black Immigration Network Coordinator and Arizona Organizer with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We'll be taking questions after each speaker finishes their presentation, so feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel throughout the conversation. You can also tweet questions to me at Bridget M. Whalen on Twitter, and we'll attempt to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. Also, feel free to join the conversation online by using the hashtag 10lessonsonrace, that's 10 the numeral, or tweeting at OpAgenda. In the coming weeks, we'll be releasing an updated tool talking about race, so today's conversation is going to be a nice preview for that. We'll be sending that tool to the participants on today's webinar, and it will also be available on our website, opportunityagenda.org. After the webinar concludes today, a short evaluation is going to pop up on your screen. Please do take the time to fill that out so we can improve future webinars based on your feedback. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email with a few different materials from today, including a recording of this presentation, and you should feel free to share that with anyone in your networks. So with that, we're going to get started. A big thank you again for joining us today, and a special thank you to each of our speakers. First up is Julie Fisher-Rao with the Opportunity Agenda.
Hello, everyone. So first, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the process that we use when we think up and put this advice into play. We spend a lot of time talking with folks around the country to get a sense of what they're struggling with, what their values are, what their aspirations are, and what they're needing in messaging, advice, and research in any kind of communication tools. And then we take a look at the research that's available, which can come from a wide variety of places, including media research, public opinion research, and public conversations, what's going on in the political narrative and pop culture. And we start to formulate some ideas, and then we send it out to the field and do a check-in. What's working, what's not? What is the experience from the field, from trying out this messaging guidance? What is it all saying? And with all of that continuous cycle, we form these lessons that we have learned and that we've learned through others over time. So with that, here's the 10 lessons, and this is an update from a piece that we brought out about 8 years ago when President Obama was first elected, called 10 Lessons for Talking About Race in the Age of Obama. It was a very popular tool, so we did decide to update it, and these are the 10 lessons that we've come up with for this year. So the number one lesson in pretty much any communication strategy is to consider your audience. Consider what are the goals of your audience, who are you hoping to influence, what do you know about their current thinking, what do you want to change about their current thinking, and what do you want them to do? Click forward, please. So it's really important to be thinking at all times, who are these various audiences? Now, we often talk about this on a scale from 1 to 5, the ones being the folks who are really with us in the audience, the folks who are part of the base, the people who, if you ask them to pick up a sign or make a phone call, they'll do it pretty quickly. 2s and 3s and 4s are the folks in that persuadable middle who could be brought over to our way of thinking, but they need the right spokespeople, they need the right messages, the right themes, values, and so on and so forth. So getting public opinion research to tell us what these folks are thinking can be really helpful. And then the 5s are the people who are on the other side of the argument, the folks who are going to be really hard to bring over if they are going to be brought over at all. And our strategy around them really needs to be to think about what their impact is on those 2s, 3s, and 4s. And one way to think about this is that we might want to spend a lot of time arguing with the 5s and telling them that they're wrong or trying to change their minds, but it might be helpful to think that we are their 5s, and so it's how likely is it that they are going to change our minds? So with that in mind, we can think, well, maybe talking or arguing with the fives is not worth my time, but rather thinking about, do they have an influence on the folks that I would like to change? So the second is to know the counter-narrative. We all hear the stories that are in the news. We all see what goes through our Twitter and Facebook and other social media feeds. We hear these conversations. So what is that really saying? What is the counter-narrative? And we've identified a few big themes that seem to come up over and over again in any conversations about race. And one is that the idea that racism is largely over and that it's dying out over time. That people of color are the ones who are obsessed with race, who just keep bringing it up over and over again. That alleging discrimination is in itself racist and divisive. So saying that something is discriminatory is actually you're the one causing the division. Claiming that discrimination is quote unquote playing the race card and is opportunistic. And the idea that civil rights are a crutch and that individual people should just do more and do better instead of relying on these protections. So those are just a few. I'm sure that many of you could add more to the dominant counter-narrative that we're all seeing. But those are a few of the main themes. And it's worth, when thinking about how we want to talk about race, really paying attention to that and what it really means and who is saying it and how we think that audiences that we want to move are hearing it. Next slide. The third lesson is to lead to shared values, and this is important because in these kinds of conversations, often we can open up space in people's heads if we back up a little bit and remind them of things that they care about, remind them that we do care about equal opportunity in this country, the idea that we're all in it together, of community, that we're a national community, that we do look out for each other, that we should care about each other's space. And equality, and people will say that they do believe in equality. I know that we might have doubts about how much they want to really see it enforced, but we do want to take advantage of the idea that people say they believe in it, say that this matters to them, open up that space to try to remind them of what this is all really about before diving in. And this doesn't need to be a long conversation, but it often can just be a primer for a conversation. You know, we need to remember what our values are really about in this country, that we care about equal opportunity, and that we look out for each other. Next slide, please. And then it's, of course, important to use values as a bridge to talking about race, racism, and other forms of oppression, and not just a marker. Sometimes it's really difficult to get into conversations about race and racism and discrimination, but we can't just say, oh, well, we all want to live in a country with equal opportunity and leave it at that and think that our audiences are going to connect the rest of the dots. Click, please. Because one example is that 85% of the excuse me, the United States population will tell you that they believe that fair treatment is a human right. So, okay, fair treatment is a human right. Everybody believes that. Click, please. Then we have a lot of people who will say, yes, I believe you. But then if you delve down into audience, you'll see that there's big differences in the way that different racial groups see this. So white people will think that everyone is treated equally in today's society. So they'll say that fair treatment is a human right, and it looks like a lot of people are being treated equally, so we're good. But then you'll see that Latino audiences and African American audiences are much more skeptical. So by just saying that fair treatment and leading with a value isn't enough. We really have to bridge into a conversation about race to really get deeper with changing the perception and the understanding of white audiences and going deeper into telling Latino and African American audiences and others what solutions we need to make that a reality. Next slide, please. And so leading into that, solutions are very important. We can talk about the problems. I think we do a really good job of that, of pointing out and having a critique of what's going wrong, where we're falling short of our values. It's really important to follow that up with what we want to change, what we want the solutions to be, who we want to enact those solutions, who is responsible for making that change, and then what our audiences can do. If they're not the decision maker, if they're not the person who can enact the change, who can they influence? Who should they be talking to? Next slide, please. And then in talking about the problem, it's important to talk about the systemic barriers. So to talk about what is happening that is causing the situation that we're in right now. And to do this, it's not enough just to state the barrier all the time. So for instance, saying that black youth are arrested for drug crimes at a rate 10 times higher than that of white is not enough information for people. That is stating a disparity, but it's not stating the reasons why that's happening. People left to their own devices, some audiences will say, well, my understanding is that black youth commit more drug crimes than white youth. Next click, please. But what we know from research is that that is not the case, that drug use, the people use drugs at similar rates, if not African-American youth use at lower rates actually, but are arrested more. So just taking that extra step to show what the barrier is and tell the whole story is really important. Next slide, please. And the next thing that's important to remember is to, when talking about systemic barriers, make sure we are getting to a systemic level. So that means moving away from only telling individual stories. So for instance, just a story of one person being pulled over in the case of racial profiling, one cop being the bad cop that makes a bad decision, to making it a very systemic story about racial profiling is actually something that happens at a systems level. It is a policy level. We all have responsibility to change it. Next slide, please. And in talking about the barriers, the systemic level barriers that we're all responsible for, it's important to particularly be explicit between the difference between race and socioeconomic disparities. A lot of folks, particularly even in liberal and progressive circles, want to conflate the two and are more comfortable having a discussion about, say, why the educational system is problematic or what we can do in low-income communities, and they forget that racial element. So bringing it in for some audiences is going to be really important in order to have a real discussion about race. Next, please. So, for example, an analysis of by the Center for Responsible Lending found that even after taking into account individual credit scores and other characteristics, Hispanic and African American borrowers were more than 30% more likely to receive higher rate subprime loans. So these stories found that there was a long history of racial discrimination in lending that led to this difference. It wasn't a difference in credit scores. It wasn't a difference in socioeconomic background. It was a racial difference. And so really making that point and finding stories that can make that point are going to be important to get people to move away from saying, if we just fix the education system or if we just, had more jobs, we would be fixing these problems. Next, please. So number 8, try to find ways to talk about how racial bias and discrimination hold all of us back. Next, please. So one really good example of this is PolicyLink has done a report called All In Nation, among others, and they also had this research report that found that the American economy would gain $2.1 trillion just by closing racial gaps. So just by trying to eliminate racial gaps, racial disparities, barriers, we would be able to increase our GDP. So there's a lot of other instances where we know that racial discrimination and inequality hurts us all. So if we can talk about how fixing that makes it better for everybody, we can make a stronger argument that brings in more and more audiences. Next, please. Number 9 is to acknowledge the progress we've made. So here you can see that most people who in this poll do believe that we've made progress, and it's important to acknowledge that so that people don't feel like we're just saying everything's bad, everything's always been bad, everything's always going to be bad, but rather we can say, look, sure, we've come a long way. You can see in the second pie chart that most people also think we have a lot more work to do. So they're not thinking things are perfect. So in acknowledging progress, you don't have to say things are perfect, but you can say, give people kind of a hopeful trajectory by saying we've come this far, we have to go further. And that also stops them from it's like a preemptive way to stop people from saying things like, yes, but what about that thing that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago or 50 years ago or the civil rights movement or whatever. Sure, those things happened. It was great. It was good. It wasn't enough. Or some of that needs still to be fixed. Next slide, please. And finally, to embrace and talk about all different races and ethnic differences. So this means trying to shy away from simply the black and white instances. And I realize that in a lot of my examples, I do have black and white stories because there's a lot of stories out there about that, and that is one of the dominant narratives, that this is about black people and white people. But we know that it's obviously much bigger than that. Immigrants face a lot of challenges that we need to talk about, as do API, Native communities, and so on and so forth. So we really need to be careful about trying to consistently point all of that out, acknowledge the diversity, and just again point out that we are better and stronger when we acknowledge diversity and when we are working towards the same things together. Finally, next slide please, just a suggestion on building a message. Click please forward. In talking to people about race and racism, we suggest a structure for building a message, which is value, problem, solution, action. Click, please. So this means that starting with values, as I talked about earlier, that can create a space in people's heads for bringing in new arguments and new ideas. Then outlining the problem in a very specific and succinct way that pinpoints what you're wanting to talk about with them at that point. There's lots of problems, so being very careful in choosing the right ones to talk about. Always having that solution in there, that's very important just to keep people looking forward and moving forward. And then finally, an action. You're talking to your audience through communications for a reason. What is that reason? What do you want them to do? What do you need them to do in order for that solution to happen, to eliminate the problem, and to uphold the values? Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. We'll now take some questions for Julie. So if you do have a question, go ahead and enter it into the question function on your GoToWebinar screen. Our first question is about the difference between talking about race and talking about racism. Julie, can you address that?
Sure. And so I think we can all acknowledge that talking about race is a little bit easier, bringing in discussions that, certainly we're different. We have different attitudes and different backgrounds, that sort of thing. Racism is really talking about oppression, right? Which groups have been in power, and which groups have suffered because of abuses of power. And it's important to not just leave discussions at race and say, sure, there are racial differences. This goes to, being really explicit about, socioeconomic versus race, and just being more explicit in our conversations generally. Yes, there are differences. Why do those differences happen? Those differences happen because of a history that has led us to where we are, in which certain people have had power and abused power, and certain people have been oppressed. And again, this also goes back to audience and being careful how we tell that story. Some audiences can't hear that kind of language, and so finding other ways to just talk about, for instance, the reason that subprime lending often happens is because there has been a history of bias and discrimination and segregated neighborhoods, versus using words like oppression and so on and so forth. But it is important to get into that discussion and not just talk about racial disparities or racial differences without talking about the reasons behind them.
Thanks, Julie. And how specific should proposed solutions be when you're using that VPSA format? Maybe you can give us an example of how to use that VPSA, but also how specific those solutions should be.
So that definitely depends on what your goal is for any communication. So if you're talking about a very specific policy that you want to have passed, that's the solution. You want to talk about increased police training, or some policy within a police department, that is. So if you're talking about just people generally becoming more aware of racial differences, racial disparities, barriers, then you might want to be talking about some of the broader things we can do as a country that would bring us together. But that all depends on what your goals are and which audiences you're talking to.
Thanks. We have a question about empathy. Does empathy have a role to play in moving people to care about and act on structural racism?
Sure, thank you. Yes, empathy is a really important piece, particularly when talking about reminding us that this is about all of us. We found in our recent study that most Americans feel that they have been discriminated against or on the outside, quote unquote, for some reason or another, whether or not they are a woman or they are in a family with somebody who is disabled, or if they are, there's so many different reasons because they're growing older. There's a lot of different reasons that people personally feel that they have experienced discrimination. And when they realize that, they are more open to understanding and realizing that other groups have experienced discrimination. And so getting that empathy foremost in their heads can be helpful in trying to remind them that this is something that we all need to work on because it's hurtful. And you know that because you've felt it yourself, maybe not in the same way as somebody else, but pulling on not wanting to feel that way yourself, not wanting to experience what happens when you've been discriminated against, can help people want to find solutions that will apply across the board.
Thanks. And we're getting a few questions around the 10 lessons being, what audience is that geared toward? We had a question about whether that's geared towards predominantly white audiences, but also going beyond that, a lot of times discussions about race and racism happen in communities of color. So how do we also engage that across all racial and ethnic bounds so that it's a larger conversation and a larger narrative that's happening across all parts of society and our communities?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that?
Sure.
Sorry.
So I guess that's okay. I'll give you them separately. So we've had a couple different questions. The first one is are these 10 lessons for talking about race specifically geared towards white audiences?
Okay, so no, these are geared towards audiences, and again, that 1 through 5 is not ideological, and it's not necessarily racial. I wouldn't assume much about your audiences unless you know them well, and so that means that there's some audiences who do understand and feel strongly about discrimination and believe that it's happening more than others. But as we saw from the percentages, that's not just people of color. There are some, it goes across the board. There's a diversity of attitudes and beliefs out there, and there's a lot of different ways to slice the pie. So I think it's getting to know your audience, getting to know the most you can about your audience is very important.
Thanks, Julie. I think we have time for one more question. Talking about race and racism goes beyond just those two issues in isolation. It also intersects with socioeconomic, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, linguistic prejudice, etc. How do you address those issues as well?
Those issues are all extremely important, and I think that these lessons are really for the instances and the opportunities where you want to talk about race and racism, where that is, for whatever reason, the goal of your conversation. And there are ways to bring in those other things and to mention that these aren't in isolation. This isn't the only problem that we have, but there are certainly instances in which you want to say, I need to have a conversation today about racism. I really do. And so these are just 10 ideas that try to open up that door and have that conversation. But it does not mean excluding all of those or forgetting the intersectionality or forgetting that we're all more than one thing, we're all more than one identity. But often it is needed, especially recently, to be able to have, to bring up the topic of racism a little more explicitly.
Julie, thank you so much. Next up, we're joined by Daryl Atkinson. He's the visiting Second Chance Fellow at the U.S. Department of Justice. Daryl.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to contextualize my comments to talk about race in the context of a campaign that I was a part of during my time in Durham, North Carolina, because I think that are grounded in a real world example of how we use some of the tools that we learned from the opportunity agenda. But before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, who I am, because it really impacts the work that I do and why I do this work. So in 1996, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime. I spent 40 months in prison, was sentenced to a 10-year sentence in the Department of Corrections in Alabama, didn't get any vocational or post-secondary educational opportunities, so I kind of just languished in prison. I consider myself a casualty of America's ill-conceived and highly racialized drug war. And because I'm the beneficiary of a system that has produced highly racialized outcomes, i.e. the criminal justice system, now I'm trying to work to improve it and in many ways dismantle it. So in 2012, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, which is a community lawyering civil rights advocacy organization, our tagline is basically we serve as general counsel for the most vulnerable communities across the South. And in 2012, we began with some of our community partners our anti-racial profiling and selective drug enforcement campaign. And the vision and values that we were really trying to tap into with the Durham community is that Durham is a place where all communities have the opportunity to thrive and succeed. That's something that no matter if that mom is from a very affluent community in the Brightleaf area or if they're from the south side of Durham in Bragtown, that's something that every mother and father and family member wants to see for their child, the ability for them to grow up and thrive and pursue their dreams that they hope to succeed. However, because of racial profiling and selective drug enforcement by the Durham Police Department, communities, particularly communities of color, black and brown communities, were limited in their opportunity to be able to thrive. For example, Durham is a county that is 38% African American. However, 82% of the motorists who were searched incident to a routine traffic stop were African American. In addition, nearly 60% of the people from Durham, 65% in fact, of the people from Durham who were in prison for drug crimes were black, 29% were Latino, so significant disparities in relation to who goes to prison for drug crimes in Durham. However, the usage rates across all demographic groups, usage and sale rates, are roughly the same. And we were seeing these really significant disparities, and they were inhibiting these communities' ability to succeed and thrive, which is contrary to a value that we knew that the majority of the people of the Durham community shared, a shared value. And because of these disproportionate contacts with the criminal justice system, these folks were getting racked up with arrests and convictions and all of the attendant collateral consequences that flowed from that. And mind you, this is happening in a community where we have an African American mayor. The city council is diverse with significant African American representation. And at this time, our police chief was Puerto Rican, and our command staff, as far as captains and lieutenants on the police department, were probably one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse in the state. And that's going to be very important. Flag this point because that's going to be very important for the three kind of lessons that I tick off at the end of my presentation that I think would be noteworthy for other people. So the solution that we proposed, we organized impacted communities to demand the following changes. One, mandatory written consent for all vehicle consent searches. So when we go back to that statistic of 83% of the African American population who were subject to the searches that were conducted in 2013, where 83% of the motorists searched by the Durham Police Department were African American. The way that they were getting in the cars was not by probable cause, was by asking the driver for their consent to search the vehicle. And they were asking African Americans and Latino drivers much more than they were asking white drivers for their consent to search, because they were operating under the assumption that African American and Latino drivers were more likely to be carrying drugs or weapons. So we found that in other jurisdictions, requiring mandatory written consent, having the officer have to get someone's signature and explain that that person doesn't have to give up their constitutional rights, has been effective in mitigating the use of verbal consent. We also, the community also demanded that they make, that the city make misdemeanor possession of marijuana the lowest law enforcement priority because we saw, once again, gross disparities on who was getting arrested and charged when usage rates are roughly and sale rates are roughly the same. We demanded a quarterly review of data related to stops, arrests, uses of force, because we felt more transparency in this area would channel the behavior of police officers. We required mandatory racial equity training for all police officers. And we instituted some reforms at the Civilian Review Board. So those were kind of the policy demands that we put forth. We won on all accounts. In fact, the LLEP, the lowest law enforcement priority conversation, is still going on and debating, but it's robust and moving in a positive direction. And so we won on all of the policy accounts. With regards to the racial equity training, that has even spilled over into elected officials. The city council and both the county commission and their component departments are going through racial equity training. Because one thing I think we overestimate in this country is our ability to understand structural and institutional racism, because we weren't taught those things. So those were the policy wins, but the culture changing wins, I think, were equally as important, and I just want to highlight one of them. And that's the role of directly impacted leadership and how we facilitated the leadership development of impacted people and impacted communities through spokesperson trainings. They were taking the lead in the press. They were taking the lead at the city council and county commission meetings. We were trying to center leadership in directly impacted communities at all times. As a result, we had to engage in training, skill development, making sure, just like we all have to engage in training and skill development, making sure that impacted communities were equipped with what they needed to be successful and in a leadership space. And that has really resulted in some very powerful transformative changes. So imagine, young men and young women who were formerly gang involved, who knew nothing about navigating or getting on a city council work session or navigating the machinery of local and municipal government. Now they know this, and they know that they can flex their power. They know that they have a voice and can effectuate change. That light switch has been flipped. They are civically engaged and civically active for perpetuity. The way I was trained is that you organize once. And once you organize a community once, they can then take it upon themselves to advocate on their own behalf on a range of issues after that. So the three lessons that I would tick off that we learned from our campaign that I think can be transferable and shared with many others is that racial equity is a language and a discipline that can be learned and that has to be learned. We engaged in almost 8 public hearings over a 7-month period during the course of this campaign. And it's important to understand that your audience, both policy decision makers and John and Jane Q. Public, have all fed into the meta counter narrative that we were trying to attack. That people get where they are in life by pulling up their bootstraps, rugged individualism, that we don't necessarily have this idea of shared fate. So is it really important that racial equity can be learned, and it's a discipline that has to be learned. Number 2, understanding and communicating the difference between diversity and equity. And this is manifested in who our leadership was. We had one of the most diverse leadership in the state, with African-American mayor, diverse city council, diverse police force and command staff. But diversity doesn't necessarily mean equity. And people, no matter their race or ethnicity, operate within institutions. And institutions operate with each other that create structures. So really understanding and embracing the 4 levels of racism, the interpersonal, the internalized, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the structural, was really important. And then lastly, the importance of sharing effective communication strategies and trainings with impacted communities. Oftentimes, members of the advocacy community can be gatekeepers themselves, and we should be trying to build power and share information with the communities that are most directly impacted so they can advocate on their own behalf. And I'll stop there.
Daryl, thank you very much. Again, if you have any questions for Daryl, go ahead and insert them into the question function on your GoToWebinar panel. We're getting a lot of questions, Daryl, around coalition building, building trust between different stakeholders so that you can make a meaningful impact. Since you gave us such a concrete real-world example, I was hoping that you could offer some steps organizations can take to address systemic racism while having a lot of different people with different backgrounds at the table.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we did with our coalition partners, and our coalition was a coalition made up of the communities directly impacted who were most likely to be profiled or arrested for a drug arrest. Faith community, white progressive folks, and yeah, I think I mentioned the African American church. So it was absolutely, and Latino communities as well, because it was a convergence with the profiling and some of the stuff around the issues that undocumented people face in some of the immigration contexts. And one of the things that we suggested is that coalition members, and it proved fruitful, go through these racial equity trainings together, develop this shared learning, this shared analysis in a group setting. One of our coalition partners, also named Spirit House, also held a citywide book reading of Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, and these book readings were done in multiracial, very diverse environments, so people could develop that shared analysis cross-racially and cross-class.
Thanks, Daryl. Another good question. Once you have diversity, how do you work toward equity?
I think is helping decision makers and stakeholders have an equity analysis. For our discussions of what racism is in this country are usually operate on a very rudimentary level, meaning interpersonal, meaning someone of one race did something bad to someone of another race. And we kind of contextualize that as an easily identifiable example of what racism is. We really don't understand very well institutional and structural racism. And I think once decision makers have a better grasp of that, they're able to make choices and decisions that lead to equitable results. And if the results don't, if the policy doesn't lead to equitable results, they should be malleable enough to shift, because we're ultimately trying to create communities in an environment where everyone can thrive.
Daryl, one last question. Can you share any specific messaging that you found was particularly effective in making a racial equity argument around stop and search, particularly to City Council and police audiences?
Yeah, I would say the dominant frame that we use was fairness. The dominant frames, rather, were fairness, equality, and opportunity. And really grounding the unfairness of disproportionately stopping African Americans and Latinos when the contraband hit rate was higher for whites. So if you want to go on a fishing expedition, you're going to catch the most fish in the white community, and it's unfair, right, that you're disproportionately deploying public resources in the form of police officers and patrols in predominantly communities of color. Opportunity from the standpoint of once you've had contact with the criminal justice system, it thwarts your lifetime opportunities, and showing how we have to be more proactive to make sure that we don't police and use our criminal justice system in a way that thwarts opportunity for all communities in Durham.
Daryl, thanks so much. Our final speaker today is Tia Oso, We have an outdated slide for Tia, but she's the national organizer with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Tia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Apologies for my outdated slide. Hello, everyone. My name is Tia Oso. I'm the national organizer for Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We are a national organization with offices in Brooklyn, New York, Oakland, California, Atlanta, Georgia, as well, soon to be Los Angeles, California, and a national network of 50 members called the Black Immigration Network. And we address the intersection of racial justice and immigrant rights in order to advocate for racial, social, and economic justice for all. And really happy to be on the webinar today talking about how important it is to talk about race and ways to do it. And what I'm going to be sharing with everyone is how at BAJI we use and develop a racial justice analysis to engage African American communities as well as allies to support progressive immigration policy. Next slide. So at BAJI, what we do is we use education, advocacy, and direct action to build alliances. And it's similar to Opportunity Agenda. Congratulations on your 10-year anniversary. This is also BAJI's 10-year anniversary that we're celebrating this year. We noticed that during the rise of anti-immigrant policies and legislation, the messaging from the anti-immigrant movement was very narrowly focused on targeting Mexican and Central American immigrants, and it also used messaging that pitted African Americans against immigrants of color by creating this narrative around black jobs. And so BAJI was founded also in the response to the anti-immigrant legislation and backlash. There was a messaging and a narrative within the immigrant rights movement that left out black immigrants, left out a racial justice analysis, and then also similarly had an adverse and oftentimes harmful narrative around African Americans. And so BAJI was formed in order to help respond and develop a racial justice analysis and develop messaging that would also galvanize African Americans in support of progressive immigration policy. And so the importance of this is, number one, in addressing anti-blackness in the migrant rights movement, both with excluding black immigrants, both in messaging but also in policy reforms, and then also by characterizing African Americans in a problematic way, you're cutting out a large community of allies. And so we knew that developing a racial justice analysis and a message was going to be really important to help complicate the narratives and build a more inclusive and stronger movement. Next slide. And so similar to some of the points that have been shared earlier in the best practices, we use education, advocacy, and alliance building to do this. And really of primary importance is the political education in developing an analysis of racial justice as well as political education tools that help African American communities to understand the root causes. We've been able to build and grow multiracial coalitions that understand the intersections of these issues and then are able to then address and build campaigns that highlight and combat and resist these different attacks on immigrant communities. And this also leads to relationship building between African Americans and black immigrant communities as well as other communities of color. Next slide. So an example of this is our real crime video, and the real crime video is a pop education piece, an animated video that we developed 2 years ago, and it is a narrative shift strategy targeting black communities to address and understand mass criminalization not as personal failings of individuals, but as a systemic issue that's targeting these communities, and then also to connect mass incarceration and immigrant detention. This video can be found on our website at Black Alliance facebook.org/therealcrime, and also on YouTube. And the messaging in the video not only points out the racialized nature of the immigration system, as well as mass incarceration and detention, and then also we end with solution-based strategies around community organizing and empowerment, and how our communities are stronger together when we fight and are not divided by these seemingly the divisions that the system would have us place in between one another. Next slide. Another really important aspect of the work that we do in discussing race is in the Black Lives Matter movement. Baji's executive director, Opal Tometi, is one of the 3 co-founders of the Black Lives Matter network. The originally began as a hashtag and is now a national, international membership network with chapters all across the country as well as internationally. And the work that we are continuing to do is in highlighting the leadership and the involvement of Black immigrants in the Black Lives Matter movement. And as you can see in the recently released policy platform, the Vision for Black Lives, making sure that immigration policy is a part of our policy demands as a movement and as we continue to fight. And really the importance in just the creation of and this galvanizing of Black Lives Matter has again begun to help us to catalyze not only mass movements in Black communities for racial justice, but also initiated and sparked a national conversation around racial justice and really digging into the enduring and really entrenched structural racism and inequality that we have not only in our policing systems but across all of the different sectors, whether it be economic, socioeconomically, whether it be in our relationships interpersonally, whether it be the impacts that people are facing within the immigration system, where you see immigrants from African and Caribbean countries facing harsher enforcement, harsher treatment, and more complexities in navigating those systems. Next slide. So some of the great results of our work has been to really galvanize Black communities to take action. This is a picture from a rally that we did in 2013. It was the first ever gathering in the nation's capital on behalf of Black immigrants. And in order to really solidify that voice and the particular impact that Black immigrant communities are facing, have to talk about race, how to have a racial justice analysis, and then also develop policy proposals and campaigns like Black Communities for Fair and Just Immigration Reform that begin to address those issues that these communities are facing. Next slide. Having a racial justice analysis and messaging and education and building alliances and relationships also was important in galvanizing communities and addressing issues that do have multiple intersections. So this picture is from an action in Los Angeles, California, called Can't Kill Africa. There's a Cameroonian immigrant, undocumented, living on Skid Row here in Los Angeles, California, where I'm currently based, who was murdered by the Los Angeles Police Department. And because of the multiple issues at play, right, we're talking about him being a Black person, him being a Black immigrant who is undocumented, him being a homeless person, also all of these different intersections. And what happened with Africa, we were able to also take the opportunity to bring the Black immigrant community in Los Angeles, the Skid Row activism community, the Black Lives Matter activism community together to give voice to what happened to Africa and demand change. And this work is still ongoing. Next slide. And so that's kind of a synopsis of the work that we do, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and why we chose to lean into a racial justice analysis, talking about questions of race that articulate explicitly Black framework around issues of immigrant rights and immigrant justice and other social and economic justice issues at the intersection, because in order to see real change and ensure real change, it's important that we're talking about the issues in a real way, and especially when addressing issues of race, it's very important that we have clear and honest analysis and communication about these issues in order to address them together. And when we work together, we can definitely make a larger impact than when we obscure these issues and obscure the role that race is playing in these different systems of oppression. And I'll stop there.
Tia, thank you so much. Once again, get your questions in for Tia. We do have a question, we've had a few questions actually around the term people of color and how that can erase particularly Black experience, but also other experiences of people of different backgrounds. Can you address that a little bit?
Yes, definitely. And so when we're talking about race, there's a lot of different ways, right, to talk about and give analysis around. And so I think that from Baji's perspective, we are a Black organization, Black-led organization, and we focus on issues that are impacting Black communities, but we also work in alliance with other communities of color as well as with white allies. And so I think when we're articulating particular impacts, especially when it comes to the way an issue acutely impacts a certain community, it is important to make the distinction. And even outside of talking about Black communities, for example, when we're talking about factors that are addressing API communities, there's a particular experience that Southeast Asian communities experience that when we're discussing different issues or discussing maybe refugee experiences, socioeconomic factors, criminalization, housing, homelessness, all of these different things, when we're talking about an issue, in order for people to really understand, especially when we're talking about root causes and impacts, it is important at times to make distinctions, and especially when we're talking about the United States and the construction of race, it is important for us to be talking in the context of the hierarchy. It's an intentional hierarchy that has white people placed at the top and Black people placed at the bottom, and is situated as such, and we're still working through that construct and that hierarchy. And so it is important for us to be talking about that and naming that and understanding it, even as we're building alliances, even as we're talking about racial disparity across ethnicities and across races.
Great, thanks. You talked a lot about intersectionality, and we've had a couple questions coming in on this balance between a unified message that tells a shared story sort of across issue, but balancing that with being worried about diluting that message on an issue that can affect multiple groups, but perhaps is more visible in one group or to a higher degree, if that makes sense. Can you address that balance?
Yeah, definitely. I think in striking a balance and talking about intersectionality as well as building alliances, what's important is to not erase or create false equivalencies. We addressed this really thoroughly in a webinar that we presented in 2014 called Transformational Solidarity, why the migrant rights movement must show up for Black lives. And in response to the kind of initial solidarity messages when Black Lives Matter hit the national consciousness around, groups wanting to express solidarity, and so saying, Black and Brown Lives Matter, for example, or, this is the same struggle. It's important that we not make false equivalencies in a rush to build unity, but we can talk about and how issues intersect. We can talk about parallels, and it's important to talk about parallels and make those connections, especially when we're talking about building relationship, and especially when we're talking about, how do we build campaigns that ensure that everyone can win? How do we build campaigns that are inclusive and messaging that is inclusive? And so it's important to draw out those distinctions, draw out those relationships, draw out those parallels without erasing what's actually happening.
Great, thank you. Can you talk through some of the steps in a racial justice analysis that you mentioned? What do you mean by that, and what does it entail?
So what it entails for Baji's work is addressing, say, really specifically when we're talking about immigration policy and taking a look at what are the impacts, and then what are the root causes of those impacts, and why is it that there's a racial disparity, and how is that manifesting, and then developing an analysis from those facts. So it begins with actually just looking at the research, looking at data. There was a presentation that had a lot of really great data in it. So when you begin first by looking at numbers and then looking at, well, how are those numbers coming to be? What is the pipeline? So what is the pipeline for, say, Black immigrants being overrepresented by 6 times their population in immigrant detention? And then we can draw a line directly to the fact that Black communities have more contact and are being targeted more by law enforcement. That law enforcement contact then leads to a criminal record, and particularly this is also in the anniversary of the 20th anniversary of the 1996 laws that expanded the criminal repercussions for folks' immigration status, and those are laws that are targeting and have a greater impact specifically on communities of color. And then because Black communities are the most targeted, the most acutely targeted, then we see this, overrepresentation within the immigrant detention system. So it begins with looking at data, looking at what's leading to those outcomes, and then developing an analysis there, and not just looking only at the results, but looking at why are these results being produced and in what ways. And then you're also able to develop your analysis based on not just the facts and the impacts, but then also the motivations, right? And that's where it begins to be very clear, right, that these are racially motivated laws and policies or practices, and then creating these racialized outcomes.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for providing such excellent questions and a really rich discussion here. I want to give a huge thank you again to Julie, Daryl, and Tia for sharing their knowledge with us today, and a special thanks also to the Opportunity Agenda staff who made today's webinar a success, especially Elizabeth Johnson, Jamila Brown, and Juhutu Kral. If you have any questions that we didn't get to today or about any of the material or just follow-up questions about our work, please feel free to reach out and we will do our best to get back to you with answers. We're going to be sending a link with a recording of this webinar and other materials, so you can share that with any colleagues who couldn't make it today. And just a reminder, as you close out of the GoToWebinar, a short evaluation is going to pop up, so please do fill that out. It really helps us in planning future webinars and making sure that we're offering you the best possible content. Thank you again so much for joining us, and have a great day.